My name is Alejandro Rourke, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HETP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. Through our community engagement, congressional education, and by serving as a national voice for Latinos in tech and telecom policy, HETP member organizations work to support the social, political, and economic advancement of Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. Today, having broadband access is inextricably linked to our health, our well-being, and our economic security. This is especially true for the Latino community, for Black and Indigenous communities of color, as well as rural and low-income households or families who are experiencing economic hardship because of the coronavirus and who may face compounding obstacles to establishing and sustaining a reliable at-home broadband connection. Central to that lagging divide is the conversation about cost, effort, and the partnerships needed to establish solutions that extend broadband infrastructure to rural and historically underserved communities across the United States at an affordable price. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Shirley Bloomfield, CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, to our kitchen table conversations about race, connectivity, and the future of everything as a part of HETP's Digital Inclusion Summit. NTCA and its members work to extend the delivery of robust and high-quality telecommunication services in underserved areas with the goal of helping to make rural communities vibrant places in which to live and do business. So Shirley, thank you so much for being with us here today. First of all, I'll start by saying that is a lofty goal. And as the CEO for the Rural Broadband Association, you work with over 850 independent community-based telecommunications companies that are leading innovation in rural and small-town America. So with that, I think comes a unique set of challenges and opportunities. And I'm hoping that you might be able to share a little bit more about the work of NTCA and about the types of barriers that rural community face achieving that kind of last mile connection to their homes.
Well, I am simply delighted to be joining you today for the conversation. I've really been looking forward to it because I think that so many times we focus on just deploy. And it's always important to step back and think about who are the communities you're trying to serve? Why is it so important to ensure that all Americans, regardless of where they live, what their zip code, what their demographics, are connected? And I'll tell you what, we have learned that more than ever over the course of the last 7 months when we've seen really, truly the impact that the pandemic has brought and the need for connectivity and what it means for those who are now working from home, those who are studying from home, people who are seeking remote healthcare. There's so many different applications. So, our challenge is, as you mentioned, I've got community-based providers across the country. They're located in 45 states. My folks are the rural of the rural. They are in the places of the country where the large carriers, when they started off telephone service many, many years ago, chose not to build networks out to. And they chose not to build into those areas because they're very rural and they're high cost and they may be geographically challenging. So my folks actually were born out of necessity to ensure that those communities at that point had telephone service. We find on average, for example, that my company serve about 7 consumers per mile of wire. Here in the Washington, D.C. area where I work, we've got, the estimates range from 1,000 to 2,000, depending on how many apartment buildings you're including in that mile. And when you think about it, that infrastructure exactly the same, the software, the hardware, the fiber optics. The difference is the number of customers you have to spread that cost among, which is why it is so much more challenging and so much more expensive to actually build into these rural communities. We've now seen the evolution of going from telephone service to broadband connectivity. And that has been an exciting evolution. I will say, the first challenges that we had with broadband deployment we're getting rural consumers to actually understand the applications. When we first started rolling out, there were a lot of people who were like, oh, what do I need faster emails for? But understanding what that broadband piece can bring in terms of, again, things that we didn't even know before the pandemic. But, you're in a rural community and you may have two kids who are capable of or able to take advanced math. How do you pull those resources? How do we pull resources that we have at our fingertips in an urban area into these rural communities and really make a difference? And the thing that I love about the carriers that I represent, as I mentioned, 45 states, they cover about 38% of the landmass. So again, think about those areas when you're in an airplane and you look down and you're like, wow, there's just a lot of land out there. That's where my folks have infrastructure. But the thing I love is they're community-based. They live and they work in these communities. Their success is tied to the success of the towns that they live in. So if they are not going to provide the solutions, whether it's broadband, voice service, mobile service in a lot of cases, and certainly video services, there's nobody else who's going to come out there and do it. Their kids go to those schools. Their neighbors work in some of those local companies and on Main Street. So the feel of what they do and the passion behind it is so genuine and so day to day for them that it's really been fun, and it's honestly been a pleasure and an honor to work for them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think when we consider this idea of kind of connecting people that live in rural parts of the country, and a lot of people maybe discount the fact that there aren't diverse populations that live there, but we actually know that specifically the Latino community is growing in rural parts of the country, right? I think their percentage of families that are moving out there, that are working out there, are really kind of trying to make a life there, and broadband is key to kind of their economic success. So as we talk about digital inclusion, the term itself clearly conveys the idea that there are people and places that have been historically excluded from the benefits of digital opportunity. So from your perspective, do you mind sharing, how you think we got here? You alluded to it a little bit in your first answer, but who do you think is most impacted, and how specifically are you working with industry and policymakers to establish, more inclusive connectivity policies to expand access to digital tools?
So that is a loaded question, but so very important, because you're absolutely right. People like to default to thinking that rural America is homogenous, and it is far from homogenous population. And so we need to look at that big picture. And the one thing I will say, when people talk about the digital divide, I really think there is a rural divide. I think there's a rural America that is served by folks like mine, community-based providers who are presenting fiber to the home to the vast majority of their subscribers. They know that their communities depend on that. And frankly, the carriers that just can't make the kind of ROI in some of these rural areas. So when you look at where the investments have been made, we have seen areas of the country that have truly been left behind. And you know what? I get it. If I had stock held shareholders that I was responsible to report up to, where you're putting that money makes a big difference. And you're putting it in the competitive markets. You're putting it where you've got high income. You're putting it where your payoff is going to be greater. So what I really see is there's two parts of rural America. That's frankly a challenge for me with policymakers, because I really need to see them as seeing two different sectors of what is happening in rural America. But what that has done is it has meant that there's a whole part of rural America that's been left behind. And we have a lot of work to do as a country to connect those people. Right now, there's a lot of efforts out there to do that. There's a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of talk by policymakers, hopefully some programs getting stood up. But we've got people today who don't have connections. We've got kids today who are going to Taco Bell parking lots to do their homework. This is the United States of America. We've got to make sure that everybody has the opportunity and has access to the same opportunities. And we can't do that in a digital economy without making sure that broadband connections are there. So that is one piece of it. The other pieces I would say is there's affordability factor. One of the things that has been really important for my providers is access to government programs, because that's what makes broadband affordable. One of the things that I loved about working on the 96 Telecommunications Act was there's a very important provision in there that codified that all Americans should have comparable and affordable services. I live to that creed, where we need to make sure that folks, regardless of their income level, have the capability to access. So, that is one of the things that the Universal Service Program that is run by the FCC is so important, because what it does is it has a high cost fund, which is important because if you just tally the cost of providing broadband to a community of 500 people, here in the metro area, I may pay, $100 a month, $80 a month, whatever it is. The actual cost for those rural consumers is usually into the $200-$300 a month mark. Nobody can afford that, regardless of your income level. So universal service makes it affordable. The other pieces about the Universal Service Program that I think are so important and sometimes overlooked is there is an E-rate program which provides assistance to school children who need that additional support, allowing schools to be able to get some of that connectivity. And then there's a Lifeline program that ensures that those of lower incomes have the ability to get, access and connectivity. So I think all of those programs together really kind of are part of our commitment as a country to say, regardless of where you live, regardless of how much you make, regardless of which school your child goes to, they should have the ability to be able to connect like everybody. So when I think about the digital divide, I think about, one piece is you got to have the connection. You got to have the network. You got to have a way to reach people. The second part is once you build it, you've got to find a way that people can afford to partake in it. And how do we do that? How do we connect all those pieces? And frankly, I just think sometimes we need to slow down and see the bigger picture. It's very easy to get really tunnel focused on build. But if you're not stepping back and saying, but which parts of our population aren't connecting and why aren't they connecting? Is it a value proposition, which it could be, or is it an affordability issue? And all of those are very important. The last thing I will share is, regarding the diversity of the folks that we see in our communities, I also have about 90 companies that serve tribal territory. You've got a whole swath of the country, again, rural America, and those also require special attention and focus. And I'm always pleased when policymakers take a step back and are able to say, how are we reaching each parts of our population to ensure that we're bringing everybody along together in this digital environment?
100%. You kind of talked about the impact of COVID-19 and the global health crisis, and really it's proven to be a perfect case study for what could and what did go wrong, and really expose the depth of the digital divide for Latino, for Black, Indigenous communities of color, for people living, again, in rural, underserved parts of the country. And it has also exposed the important role that broadband plays in all of our lives. This year, the FCC launched its $20 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund to expand broadband deployment in rural parts of the country, which represents one of the most focused investments of taxpayer dollars made to help bridge the gap across rural America. From your perspective, how can the FCC make the best use of those funds? And how far will that type of investment get us in terms of connecting historically underserved communities?
So the good news is it's almost like the FCC had weird foresight, right? They had this program that Chairman Pai has been kind of working on the last 2 years, and having it get stood up, to your point, right when we've learned all these lessons, right when we've learned what it means when school children are disconnected, what does it mean when people can't get on a VPN while their kids are studying at home, having enough, even if you have broadband, having enough capacity to do the things we know you need to do. So the thing about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that I think is very exciting is that it is a fund that will really focus on the unserved parts of our country. And there are unserved parts of our country. And again, it's hard to believe, but there are folks who will, settle for probably less than they should to just be able to have access. So the beauty of this is they are going to roll out first. They're going to start the auctions literally as your conference is kicking off. And what they're going to do is go to the areas of the country where carriers have frankly called uncle, where they basically said, look, you know what, I haven't served it to date, and I'm not going to serve it. And that allows others to basically do kind of some assessing and see what makes sense for them to go in and make some of these investments. And hopefully what we'll see is folks actually getting in there, bidding. It's a reverse auction, which means least cost bidder wins, which I have a few issues with. But I think at the end of the day, looking at $10 billion over the next couple of years as we get started with this program means real dollars will be going into some of these communities. So I think that, I think there's a couple of things we need to be mindful of. It will get started, but in a large part of the country, it's going to be too late to build. You start getting into the Dakotas, Montana, some of the Northern Plains area, you can't do construction until the spring. So it will, people will not be turning around and getting broadband tomorrow. The second thing that I think is kind of interesting about all of these initiatives from policymakers kind of coming together at the same time is that we're now seeing supply chain issues. So that's the other piece that I think we've got to be mindful of, that at the same time we are finally having a more coordinated effort to deploy broadband. We're seeing it's harder and harder to get a hold of fiber optics, to get a hold of CPE, to get a hold of consumer equipment. So I think we're going to need some government support in those arenas as well to really push some of the supply chain issues. But I do think the initiative's really exciting. I think the other thing that's important, just being very frank, is there is a limited amount of government support. You've got the FCC with universal service and RDOF. You've also got USDA that for rural markets has been extraordinarily key as a banker to actually give loans and grants and loan grant combinations through not only the traditional broadband program, but through the new Reconnect program that Congress authorized about a year and a half ago. That to date, by the end of the year, will put $1.2 billion into the ground, again, in unserved and in underserved parts of the country. Because those resources are so valuable, we've got to make sure that policymakers make the best use of it. Don't put these two programs in the same area to compete against each other. Don't let federal dollars compete against federal dollars for overbuilding when we've got so many people who don't have connections to begin with. So I know a lot of people like to default to competition's great, it'll bring the best services and prices. Yeah, that's a great concept, and that works here in Washington, D.C. If you are struggling to make a business case to put broadband in the first place in a rural, high-cost market, you know what? Competition not only doesn't work, it cannibalizes what you're trying to do, and it means there are fewer rural Americans that will be able to reach. But I am very bullish about this program, and I'm very excited to see it get kicked off.
No, thank you so much for that. I think that really paints a clear picture about the unique barriers that rural communities face to being connected. And I think that that really kind of brings me back to kind of like our last question of our quick kind of fireside chat. So it's this issue of kind of like achieving the goal of full digital inclusion and universal broadband adoption really will take a collaborative, integrated approach with policymakers, with private industry, right, with existing internet service providers, and in partnership with local communities. From your perspective, are there specific steps that Congress, regulators, and broadband providers can take and the digital inclusion advocates can promote to deliver real solutions for diverse communities across the country?
So you are hitting what is probably the hub of this wheel with your question there. So yeah, there's a lot of things that I think can take place, but I'm going to narrow it down for you. I think, what we don't do, we don't have the critical conversations. And I will say bringing these things closer to local communities is really where I see the magic happening, even if you bring it down to a state level. So while I think that the federal government is really important in terms of resources, funding, some coordination, the areas that I have seen make the most progress on digital inclusion, capturing all communities within their area, are some of the states that have actually created broadband task forces. This is a way to get people who are boots closer to the ground, convening the right people for these discussions, whether it is diverse communities, whether it is rural citizens, whether it is those who are low-income individuals. When I see them sitting around the table at a state level, talking with superintendents of schools, talking about local health with local health providers. Those are the conversations that need to take place. And the other thing I think that is key there, states, and I will throw out the state of Minnesota, for example, has a border-to-border program. They are exemplary. They make sure that every community has a voice at that table. And then they look at a map and they map out where's broadband not, what is the affordability factor, and then say, what can we do as a state to plug these gaps and figure it out? When it comes to, whoops, we're finding out in September, kids aren't going to be able to go back to school. What the role the state has been able to play to say, all right, which school children aren't connected? And if it's affordability, how do we work with the providers to connect them at their home? And how do we make it affordable for those families during this crisis time? So again, I think there's a role. I like to bring it a little bit closer to where folks actually live and work. And I think state governments can play a really important role.
Absolutely. I think that bringing stakeholders together, bringing existing internet service providers together to and that's one of the things that I think is really, that I really paid attention to during the pandemic is how all kind of internet service providers, the ones that you represent, and I think a lot of the big ones across the country have really stepped up, right? And said, you know what, we want to work with you and the communities to figure out and establish new solutions to make sure that everybody that needs to be connected can get connected. And I think that's why I think I'm optimistic about both this moment and the future, going forward. So Shirley, thank you so much for a great conversation. And thank you for everyone who's watching from home. Please make sure to follow at @sbloomfield15 on Twitter and NTCA. I will make sure to link their information in the video description below. And please also make sure to follow HTTP on our social channels at HTTP Policy to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations presented as a part of this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. So until then, tune into the conversation, speak out, and stay connected because the future needs your help. Till next time, have a good one.